Now, over 200,000 people are still under a do not drink order when it comes to drinking their tap water. But for the ones that have had their tap water, that have had their do not drink order rescinded, are starting to get sick. Now, one example is a Kanawha City resident named Shane Kasdorf. Now, he actually went into the shower and came out complaining of burning eyes, rashes, and he's in one of the areas where you were allowed to drink the water and use the water. So that pretty much shows that right now the water is still incredibly unsafe. In fact, since the order to not drink the water was released, over 100 people have entered the emergency room, complaining of eye irritation, stomach pain, vomiting, and diarrhea. Some of those effects that I believe Jordan had pointed out last week were effects of MCHM. Richard Dennison, who was a scientist for the Environmental Defense Fund, actually told the New York Times earlier the EPA's calculation on how much MCHM is actually allowed in the water system that they say is safe was actually founded in an unpublished study. And now just recently, the CDC is telling pregnant women not to drink the water. So, I mean, look, man, this is obviously still a huge, huge problem going on in West Virginia. A lot of health effects of MCHM. So I just want to throw this over to the panel and see what you guys think about this.
Oh, I mean, I don't want to like blame the victims immediately, but that's what I'm going to start off with. If you're told that the water is safe to drink, you got to wait a few days after a big spill like this. Like, these people literally went out and started showering and drinking the water, which I know it's hard to say don't do that, but you really got to wait a little longer because you know that just because the government says it's safe, that shouldn't mean it's safe. Now, like, the spill is obviously a disaster, and it's actually one of the few cases that I will ever say in my life where zoning laws could have prevented it, because for some reason this chemical storage facility was allowed to be placed right next to the water supply. So immediately if the water spilled, it's going to get into the water supply and it's a total disaster. But it's obviously a bad job by the government by telling people the water is safe to drink, because I'm pretty sure that 100 people that went to the emergency room was more people that than before they knew about the spills. So when they first warned them, I think it was like 30 or 40 people had already been to the emergency room that the water was dangerous, and now they say it's perfectly safe, and you got 100 more sick people. So it's a bad job by the government. We're not even into the chemical company thing, but it's just a bad job all around. Don't drink the water until at least 8 days after they say it's cool. That's my rule.
To build on your point, Sean, another failure of the government is actually, when it comes to the regulation system, is that MCHM is just one of 64,000 other chemicals in use in the United States that are actually being grandfathered in to the 1976 Toxic Substances Control Act. And that pretty much means that there are absolutely no requirements that anyone prove whether or not they are safe. Now that's an absolute failure of oversight.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and jump on. We're about to, like, tonight we are starting off coming, I think some people would argue kind of hard for the right here. I'm going to jump on the blame the victim bandwagon from a different angle than Sean did, but with the caveat that anybody who watched the show last week knows that I got no love for this coal company or for the government, with lax regulations, and we'll develop that further tonight because there's a Coke element to this story, as there seems to be with every story around bad things that happen. But the two little points of contention, I guess maybe you could say. Hopefully that's not too strong of a word, because if these people are genuinely sick, then obviously I feel horribly for them. But one. You got to flush your water system. Like, they say that the water supply is safe to go. That doesn't mean they came to your house and cleaned your water. You have to flush the water out of your water system, out of your pipes and everything, before you have the clean, good-to-go water. And this article, we should cite the source here. We're looking at Al Jazeera, which does great journalism, but they don't mention specifically whether or not these individuals who got sick did indeed, take those precautionary steps. And in fact, they do name one gentleman by name. So it's not like they're just looking at the group here. They did talk with individuals, and they never mentioned whether or not these people took those steps. And then the second thing I want to say is the placebo effect is super, super strong. And if people think they're going to get sick, then they get sick. And again, if these people may have genuinely gotten sick. I'm not saying I know that they don't. I'm just saying, there are some reasons to be a bit skeptical.
Well, okay. So to address a couple of those points, the MCHM is actually still in the water. It's just at a level where government officials are actually saying, no, that's okay. This is an acceptable amount.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point.
That they actually don't know, because how can they sit there and say that it's an acceptable amount when there's not enough information on MCHM to begin with? So I think it was very, very irresponsible by the government to say that it's safe.
I mean, those amounts are totally arbitrary, Lo. If you guys remember after the Fukushima disaster, one of the things that the EPA did is they just raised the level of the amount of background radiation that's acceptable for you. So they just raised it up a little bit because all that gets in there. I'm not
that's the problem. That's a huge problem.
Right. And so those levels are totally arbitrary. That's like the argument that the EPA just tells you how much you can pollute rather than stops you from polluting. But Jordan made a good point that you have to flush your water system, and if the government didn't do a good enough job telling people of that, then that's another horrible job, because I know from personal experience that if they're doing any kind of work around here where they have to shut off the water, that the water's going to come out brown from my faucet, and I know I have to let it run for a little bit before I can use it. So but some people don't have that common knowledge. So you could you got to warn people about stuff like that, but still I would be extremely non-trusting of the government, since there was one study that's unpublished that said this is safe at this level. Then I would be super skeptical if I was the people in West Virginia.
To sort of get to that distrust of what the government says, do you think that has to do with, I don't know, the connections between the West Virginia government and the business interests within that state? Because they are a heavily they're a heavy coal producing state. So yeah, that's their primary economy. So you're going to have a lot of politicians in that economy, in that state, saying no, everything to do with coal is pretty safe. Don't worry about it. We're fine. We got it.
Yeah, no, but that's part of that should be, and Sean will probably disagree with this, but that should be part of that's part of the role of the federal government. That's why we have state regulatory agencies and a federal regulatory agency, because it makes sense. I'm not going to fault a local or state government for being a hard sell on environmental issues whenever their entire voting bloc is made up of people who depend on that industry. And that's where you have an arbitrary player, like what the EPA should be, to come in and say, hey, listen, I understand you're watching out for the rest of your people, but we've got to approach this dispassionately and kind of removed from that, and we hate to do it, but you're going to have to, kind of buckle down on this, because it's bad for everyone, including if something goes wrong, your local people. But unfortunately, we don't have that system. What we have is the local and state governments who are looking out for their best people and sometimes screw up, and don't act in their best interest, even though they think they are. But then you've got a federal system that's bought off by the highest bidder, and has nothing to do with being, just slanted, in favor of the people, but it's slanted in favor of their donors, and it doesn't serve that purpose. The whole idea that this amount comes from a journal article that was unpublished, from an unpublished study, I should say. All right, to be fair, whenever this event happens, you don't have time to let a study happen, be published, be peer reviewed, and get published. But at the same time, that's still a failure by the EPA, because they're allowing this industry to operate with this massive amount of this unstudied chemical, and that should never have had. Like these studies should have been published before these companies were allowed to use this chemical. The fact that we have this chemical that we knew enough about to know it was bad, but not how bad, is a scathing indictment of how spineless the EPA is.
And quote by Richard Dennison again. He said of this whole thing, the way that the EPA has done this, quote, "This is a significant departure from how the EPA normally calculates risk." Mm. Just to go on your point, and I think part of that is the massive defunding. Just in the recent sequester bill, I have actually addressed this point of where the EPA was defunded by 20%. At least, and there's been continuous cuts at the EPA. There's been, as you say, they don't have any spine because they can't stand up to all the moneyed interests in Washington.
I mean, you have multiple issues here, right? And I get your point, and I'm actually not against the EPA like most people in like the conservative side, or I guess, because the EPA technically with the Clean Air and Water Act, they're so basic that they regulate externalities in the market. So and that goes across state lines, air and water. So like the EPA as a premise makes sense, but like we also got to fault the Department of Environmental Protection, or whatever their state version of the EPA is called in West Virginia, because they had no rules or anything in place. Like somebody, I can't believe that in a country where we have such ridiculous zoning laws that you can't like build a pool in your own backyard if you want to without getting 800 permits, that you're allowed to store chemicals right next to where they keep the water. Like that makes no sense in the world to me. It's just I just don't get it. Like I don't understand.
That particular chemical, MCHM, doesn't fall under the purview of regulation. And that's one of the major problems.
Right. But that's it's grandfathered in federally, but you still have state. West
Virginia state law. It doesn't. It also does not fall into West Virginia state law purview. So,
yeah.
You don't even need to have inspections there according to state law.
Yeah, but forget inspections. I get what you're saying about inspections, right? You should have some kind of inspection, obviously, right? It's a toxic chemical.
And the last one it had was in 1991.
Yeah, but these coal mine disasters have shown that inspections don't mean anything, because if you don't have a way to enforce them, I mean, how many of these coal mines, when there's an accident, do we see, oh yeah, they've been failing inspections for 20 years? Well, so what? There's no way you don't do anything to them when they fail an inspection. Nothing happens.
Well, you get a fine. Like they don't shut you down.
Maybe.
It was like the BP oil spill. Like the BP was the most fined oil company in their offshore rigs, and amusingly, that particular rig was given a grade by itself. So the grades mean nothing either, because you could have an amazingly safe rig that will blow up or whatever. But
and whenever the oil industry is paying the congressmen who write the laws about the rules, then the rules don't mean a darn thing.
Yeah, well, we've got two different issues here. We have the issue of that fines don't do jack, and the other issue is, of course, about, like Jordan mentioned, you've got the congressmen being bought off by big oil, big coal, writing the rules.
Yeah, but the point I'm trying to make is even more basic than that. It's like the reason you can't smoke a cigarette in a gas station is because it's a really fucking stupid idea. Like, why was this plant right next to their water treatment facility? Like, that makes no sense.
No, not even next to a water treatment facility. It was right next to a water source.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. It's right next to their water supply. All right, like.
Who thought that was a good idea?
Last week, Rhea and I, kind of butted heads a little bit over, and not really, but sort of over, like natural gas exploration and stuff like that, and whether or not that's a source. And one big problem with it is it gets into the water supply, because where natural gas is located, oftentimes, coincides with water sources, and so whenever you drill and those wells leak, it gets into the water supply. This wasn't where something was being drilled. This wasn't even like a coal mine that could have collapsed and flurries that were being stored nearby, or slurry I should say, could get into the water. Like, this is a completely man-made edifice meant to store this chemical that it wasn't based on where this resource was extracted from, and it was stuck next to a water source. Like, there was absolutely no argument. At least now, guys who are watching, feel free in the comments if you know more or understand this chemical in a way we don't. We're missing something. Please, by all means, tell us. That's what this TYT community show is about, where we can interact. But from where I'm sitting, like, there's no excuse. There's not even a counterpoint, that I might disagree with. Like, it's just pure stupidity. Why do you put this many chemicals next to a water supply?